What would you do if your neighborhood's HOA tried to erase the memories that make your house a home? When Martin West found a notice demanding he strip his porch of its personality, he didn't just fight back, he built something unforgettable. Stay with me to discover how one man's rebellious creativity turned a petty HOA rule into a neighborhood legend. And if you enjoy stories of everyday people standing up for what matters, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more tales. I'd always prided myself on my cozy, albeit slightly cluttered, front porch. I'm not talking about a rickety bench with peeling paint and a few dying ferns. No, my porch was my private haven. It had a pair of Adirondack chairs with colorful cushions my grandkids had painted for me, a wind chime fashioned from old silver spoons I collected in my traveling years, and even an eclectic birdhouse or two. Some might call my taste eccentric, but my little corner of the neighborhood felt genuine, vivid, alive, comforting. Then one Tuesday morning, I found a crisp white envelope pinned to my mailbox by a magnetic clip. At first, I assumed it was just one of those pesky real estate flyers with pictures of perfect houses and happy families. But the bold letters on the envelope spelled out, "Attention, HOA Notice." My heart sank a bit. Our Homeowners Association was known for having more rules than you can shake a stick at: lawn height restrictions, guidelines on the number of flower pots, the color temperature of porch lights. You name it, they regulated it. I'd had a few harmless skirmishes with them in the past, mostly about my preference for unique yard ornaments. But those were always resolved politely enough. Still, my curiosity was piqued, and maybe a little dread set in too, so I peeled the envelope open. The letter was typed in that stiff corporate font. "Dear Mr. Martin West, per the updated community guidelines, your current porch decor is found to be out of compliance. Residents are limited to 2 decorative items, in neutral colors only. Your front entrance currently features multiple items that deviate from standard guidelines, including, but not limited to, brightly painted seating, multiple potted plants with unapproved containers, and multicolored wind chimes. Please remove excess and unapproved porch decorations within 7 days or face a fine." I rubbed my temples and reread the letter, feeling a growl rise in my throat. 2 decorative items in neutral colors? Who were these people kidding? My mind wandered to so many years of stories behind each knickknack: the pair of old railroad lanterns from my father's workshop, the clay pot my late wife, Sarah, had hand-painted with sunflowers, the handcrafted mosaic tile that proudly displayed our family name. All of that was unapproved decor. It struck me as heartless. These folks had no sense of nostalgia or personal expression, only sterile uniformity. I glanced around the neighborhood from my vantage point at the top step. Each house was a variant of the same drab theme: taupe siding, asphalt shingles, and front lawns that looked eerily uniform, as if cloned and meticulously pruned by the same invisible gardener. A few neighbors strolled by, giving me the customary smile and wave that people do when they don't want to ask how you're really doing. My friend Harriet from next door paused, raised an eyebrow, and mouthed, "Again?" I flashed the letter her way in exasperation. She just shook her head sympathetically and went on her morning walk. I'd worked and saved to buy this house for my family many years ago. Sarah and I had dreamed about a comfortable porch where we'd watch the sunset, chat about our day, or sip iced tea in the gentle dusk. Now, it felt as though a group of self-appointed porch police were telling me how to live my quiet life. The idea rankled me more than the possibility of the fine. In years past, I might have just grumbled, removed a few things, and let it go. But there was something about the phrase, "in neutral colors only," that set me off. Life wasn't neutral. The memories that shaped who I am certainly weren't neutral. Each piece of decor carried a story, and I wasn't about to reduce my life to a bland, forgettable footnote. I thought about ignoring the notice altogether. Let them levy a fine, see if I cared. But my retirement fund wasn't exactly overflowing. Besides, ignoring these folks could be like stepping into quicksand. Once they got you, they'd sink you deeper and deeper in bureaucracy until you had no choice but to surrender. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cold glass of homemade lemonade, counting the potted plants and whimsical bits of decor. Maybe I could tuck a few of them into the backyard, hidden from the watchful eye of the HOA. But that felt like defeat. It felt like betraying Sarah's memory. After all, she'd chosen many of those trinkets. They were testaments to our shared days, our joys, our sorrows, our triumphs. I couldn't stomach the idea of packing them away in the dark of my garage. I turned my attention instead to the facade of the porch itself. The porch roof created a little nook, a small extension of my living room where I'd wave to passers-by or read the newspaper. I had a small wooden table, some chairs, and an old bar stool someone had given me. Then, in a moment of either foolishness or brilliance, it was hard to tell which, I had an idea. If the HOA wanted to be petty, maybe I'd meet their pettiness with creativity. I remembered a trip to Dublin, Ireland decades ago when I was on a business trip in my 40s. I walked into a dimly lit wood-paneled pub that was no bigger than a suburban dining room, but pulsed with laughter, camaraderie, and the gentle strum of a guitar in the corner. I never felt so welcomed anywhere in my life. Right then and there, I thought, what if I reclaimed this porch in a similar way? Make it a tiny corner of conviviality, a place where neighbors, friends, or even the mailman could feel welcomed. And if the HOA wanted rules, well, I'd follow them, but I'd do it on my own terms. Before the sun fully dipped behind the houses, I started jotting down ideas. My hand moved faster than my brain as I scribbled on the back of the HOA Notice. Maybe it was time to transform my porch from a casual seating area with random decor into something more purposeful, something to spark conversation. An old barrel as a table, a few reupholstered stools, some subtle string lights. A small sign, perhaps, Martin's Porch Pub, where everyone's welcome. I wasn't entirely sure what the HOA rules might say about turning one's porch into a personal pub, but the wheels of rebellion were already turning in my head. This was my home, and I was going to stand up for the life I'd built, even if it meant turning a few heads in the neighborhood. The morning after my late-night brainstorm, I woke up with excitement thrumming in my chest. It had been a while since I'd felt quite so alive. Maybe it was the energy of a newfound project, or just good old-fashioned defiance. Either way, I set to work, making a list of what I'd need to transform my porch into something truly special. First, I had to check the HOA bylaws. Sure, I was mad, but I wasn't looking to bury myself in legal fines or to get forced out of my own home. Over the years, I'd managed to collect the giant manual they handed out when you moved in 8 sections, each thick enough to be its own phone book. Sifting through the small print, I noticed there were strict regulations about the paint colors on the exterior walls, the wattage of outdoor bulbs, and even the type of wood allowed for porch railings. But nowhere in the labyrinth of guidelines did it specifically say you couldn't have a bar on your porch. The letter of the law never mentioned repurposing your porch furniture to resemble a pub. With a wicked grin, I realized that as long as I met the bullet points, keep a certain color for the porch rails, no bright overhead lights disturbing neighbors, no excess decor out of compliance, I might just be able to fly under the radar, or at least force the HOA to get very creative if they tried to shut me down. They'd have to create a brand new rule for me, which I suspected would take them forever. Bureaucracies don't move quickly, especially not HOAs that rely on monthly meetings and petty committees. Next came the practicalities. I pulled my old wooden barrel out of the garage. I'd used it as a side table in the den for years, but it had gotten a bit worn. With some elbow grease, thorough sanding, and a fresh stain, it could be a charming centerpiece for my porch pub. I also found a couple of mismatched stools, one I'd picked up from a yard sale, the other donated by a friend who was downsizing. Neither was in great shape, but a few coats of black paint and some new upholstery would do wonders. On the question of decor, I realized I could salvage some of my existing porch items in a new, more uniform color scheme, just to keep the HOA from having a full-blown seizure. A cunning thought. If the HOA insisted on neutral colors only, maybe I'd unify everything in a tasteful muted palette, like a warm brown or cream. I could always add color in more subtle ways that might be less likely to trigger any official complaint. A few amber glass candle holders, some vintage postcards from pubs around the world hung at eye level, a discreet Guinness poster or two, and maybe string lights, tasteful ones, the kind with filament bulbs that exude a gentle, warm glow. I remember Harriet peeking at me over the fence that separated our backyards. She's always in her garden, wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat that makes her look like a character in an old Southern novel. "You're up to something, Martin," she teased, her gaze flicking to the pile of wooden planks and sandpaper stacked by my garage door. I winked conspiratorially. "Oh, you'll see." Over the next few days, I dedicated my afternoons to preparing the space. I measured the porch dimensions to ensure I wasn't violating any walkway clearance regulations, another obscure rule from the HOA manual. Then I hammered, sanded, painted, and stained. My muscles ached in places I'd forgotten existed, but by the end of each day, there was tangible progress. Piece by piece, my porch evolved from a mismatched clutter into a carefully orchestrated design. Some neighbors would slow down as they passed my house. A few even stopped for a brief chat. It wasn't every day you saw a retiree with paint-stained jeans refurbishing old bar stools in the front yard. One gentleman from 3 doors down, Bill Withers, not the singer, though I like to joke about that, came by with a lemonade pitcher and a curiosity too big to suppress. He nodded appreciatively at my handiwork. Been living on this street for 10 years, and I've never seen so much excitement, he remarked. I gave him a grateful smile. It's amazing what a pesky HOA notice can inspire. Bill chuckled. A man's got to do what a man's got to do, right? In the evenings, I'd head inside, shut the door, and strategize. I make sure I wasn't forgetting any detail. Did the porch lighting violate any lumens regulation? Probably not if I used low-watt bulbs. Did I need any special permit to serve beverages? It wasn't a commercial enterprise. I wasn't selling drinks, so no, I didn't. Did the HOA have rules about gatherings or noise? Sure, they had a noise ordinance, but I wasn't planning raucous all-night parties. I was just envisioning a cozy seat or two, maybe a small group of neighbors enjoying a laugh. Occasionally, I'd glance at Sarah's sunflower pot, now perched protectively on my mantel. I decided to keep it safe indoors for the moment to avoid harassment from the rule sticklers. I felt a twinge of sadness. She would have loved this rebellious transformation. She was always the more adventurous spirit in our marriage. She'd grown up in a strict household, so as an adult, she had this zest for coloring outside the lines. I could almost hear her voice encouraging me. Go on, Martin. Don't let him push you around. By the end of that week, I had the major pieces in place. The barrel was now a handsome bar table, gleaming with a fresh coat of varnish. The stools were uniform black with cushioned seats covered in a thick, neutral fabric. I'd taken down the wind chimes to avoid direct confrontation, but I secretly planned on rehanging at least one set, maybe in the back porch where no one would see it. Tiny string lights were coiled around the posts, not bright enough to constitute a nuisance, but giving off a gentle glow that would be inviting once the sun went down. Standing back with a critical eye, I took in the new look. It was simpler, definitely more polished, yet it hinted at something distinctly pub-like, intimate, relaxed, and welcoming. There was still work to be done, some finishing touches, and probably a sign. I was already tinkering with ideas for that sign, maybe something shaped like a wooden plank with Martin's Porch Pub etched in an elegant script. If the HOA wanted me to remove items, I'd comply with their color scheme demands and keep the porch organized. But the shape, style, and function were still mine to define. In the hush of dusk, I allowed myself a moment of pride. Let them try to say it was against the rules. As long as I adhered to the letter of their codes, they couldn't shut me down without making themselves look downright ridiculous. And if they tried, well, I was ready for a fight, an intelligent, creative, and neighborly one. If they wanted a dull, colorless existence, that was their choice. But it didn't have to be mine. The day I unveiled my porch pub to the world, I felt like a kid on Christmas morning. The signage, a small wooden plaque that read Martin's Porch Pub, hung neatly on the porch wall at eye level. A few potted succulents, tastefully placed, lined a railing. Succulents, after all, came in subdued green tones, perfectly neutral if you ask me. The Adirondack chairs had been replaced with more approved seating, those black stools and a modest bench with beige cushions. The transformation was subtle enough to avoid the HOA's immediate wrath, but different enough that any curious passerby couldn't help but do a double take. That evening, I set up a small pitcher of iced tea unsweetened to reflect my new refined vibe and placed a couple of glass tumblers on the barrel table. If anyone was brave enough to knock, I'd be ready to pour them a drink. Harriet, as expected, was the first to drop by. She walked up the steps, wide-eyed with delight, almost forgetting to remove her straw hat. "Martin, you outdid yourself," she said, taking in the glow of the string lights. "Is this seat taken?" "It's all yours," I replied, sliding the stool out for her. I poured her a generous glass of iced tea. "Welcome to my porch pub. Well, I guess a tea pub at the moment." She laughed. "I love it. It's cozy, Martin, and definitely more inviting than that formal living room of yours." She gave me a playful nudge. Sarah would be so proud. A part of me tightened at the mention of Sarah. In the swirl of my building frenzy, I hadn't realized how emotional this might be, hosting people in a space that was sort of dedicated to her memory. I masked my emotions with a smile and clinked my glass of iced tea against hers. "I think so, too." Shortly after Harriet's arrival, Bill ambled up the walkway, lured by the sight of actual human interaction in a neighborhood that usually shut its doors by dinner time. He claimed a spot on the bench, happily accepting a refill when I offered. Soon, two more neighbors, Alice and Frank, saw us chatting and asked if they could join. Before I knew it, we had 6 people seated around my little porch, laughing, telling stories, and sipping iced tea as the sun set over the identical roofs. The conversation was free-flowing. Harriet told a comical tale about chasing squirrels out of her vegetable patch. Bill reminisced about his father's old Cadillac, which used to be the envy of the entire block back in the 1960s. Alice raved about her new black Labrador puppy, showing off pictures on her phone. It was like the old days when people actually knew the names of the folks living next door. I half expected someone to break out a guitar or ask for a round of sing-along songs. Just as I was beginning to think this was the sweetest evening I'd had in months, maybe years, I spotted a familiar silhouette strolling up the sidewalk. Joe Harding, the HOA president, complete with his trademark navy blazer and a perpetual scowl. The energy shifted like a cold breeze blowing through the warm night air. He hesitated at the foot of my driveway, scanning the scene with his hands in his pockets. I decided to be neighborly, raising my glass of iced tea and calling out, "Evening, Joe. Care to join us? Plenty of seats." He walked closer, his brows knit together. "Interesting setup you have here, Martin." He eyed the sign, the barrel, the lights. I could almost see the gears turning in his head as he tried to decide whether this was an infringement on the new HOA porch regulations. "Just followed your guidelines," I said calmly, gesturing around. "Neutral colors, limited decor, and I made sure not to obstruct the walkway." A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. "Yes, well, it does seem to be within regulation. But we've had a few neighbors comment on the gathering here. We need to ensure no public disturbances." I forced a polite grin. "We're a small group, just having some tea and conversation. It's hardly a rager." At that, Bill let out a hearty laugh, which sounded more like a muffled cough. "We're a bunch of retirees, Joe. We're not exactly partying like college kids on spring break." Harriet chimed in with a sweet smile. "We'd love for you to join us, Mr. Harding. This porch pub is open to everyone." Joe Harding paused, like he wasn't sure if he was being teased or genuinely invited. He surveyed our group, who collectively exuded an unthreatening vibe, friendly, polite, maybe a bit too folksy for his tastes. In the end, he cleared his throat. "I appreciate the invitation," he said, albeit stiffly, "but I'll pass for tonight. I just wanted to ensure everything was appropriate. Good night." He pivoted on his heel and walked off into the twilight. A collective sigh of relief passed over the group. Perhaps we dodged a bullet, or maybe we just postponed the inevitable confrontation. Still, the moment he was gone, the lively chatter resumed, and the rest of the evening slipped by like a comforting dream. People lingered longer than I expected, which gave me a warm glow of satisfaction. We said our goodbyes around 10 o'clock, late for our quiet neighborhood. I tidied up the glasses and turned off the string lights, shutting the door behind me with a sense of accomplishment. In that hushed moment, I realized I felt connected to my neighbors in a way I never had before. We turned a once lifeless suburban road into a gathering place for people to share, laugh, and find company. All thanks to a petty HOA notice that dared to stamp out individuality. Ironically, it sparked exactly the opposite, a renewed sense of community. I wasn't naive, though. I knew Joe Harding would be back, probably with a notepad full of new concerns. But for tonight, at least, I savored the satisfaction that I'd found a way to keep my memories and my personality alive on my porch. If there were battles to fight, they could wait until morning. Over the following weeks, word of Martin's Porch pub spread quietly but steadily. Neighbors would walk by and wave, sometimes stopping for a quick chat or a cool beverage if I happened to be out there. Occasionally, I'd set out a small dish of peanuts or pretzels, further cementing the pub vibe. The reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Some folks remarked that they hadn't felt such a sense of camaraderie in the neighborhood in years. Despite the goodwill, I sensed tension simmering under the surface. I spotted Joe Harding circling the block more frequently, sometimes in his car, other times on foot with an HOA colleague or two. I figured they were looking for any sign of rule breaking or an excuse to send another official letter. Yet I'd stayed scrupulous about compliance. My color scheme was neutrals. My decor was minimal, no more than 2 or 3 carefully chosen pieces. I kept the lights low after 10, and I didn't host big gatherings, at least not ones that would extend past a reasonable hour. Then, one morning, another white envelope appeared. This time, I didn't open it right away. I set it on my kitchen counter, paced around, and brewed a cup of coffee. I felt my nerves tighten. Part of me expected a direct confrontation, demanding I dismantle the entire porch pub. Finally, I worked up the courage to read it. Inside was an invitation, a formal notice to attend the upcoming HOA board meeting to discuss concerns regarding porch use and potential amendments to the neighborhood guidelines. The language was stuffy, but the message was clear. They wanted to interrogate me. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center, a squat, tan building with a multipurpose room that smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a collared shirt and an uneasy smile. The room was set up with folding chairs and a long table at the front where the board members would preside. Joe Harding sat at the center of the table, flanked by a few other board members who looked vaguely bored already. To my surprise, about a dozen neighbors, many from my pub nights, had also shown up. Harriet gave me a reassuring nod as I took a seat. Bill even patted me on the shoulder. It was heartening to see them there. It reminded me I wasn't fighting this battle alone. Joe Harding cleared his throat. "Meeting called to order," he said in that stiff official tone. After the usual motions and minutes, he came to the main agenda item, porch use guidelines. He launched into a speech about maintaining community standards, ensuring uniformity, and preventing property value depreciation. It was the same tired rhetoric I'd heard 100 times. Once he finished, he addressed me directly. "Mr. West, you've been using your porch in a manner that, while seemingly compliant, has raised concerns. Several board members feel that transforming a porch into a quasi-business establishment, what you've termed a pub, may violate the spirit of our guidelines. We'd like to hear your perspective." My throat felt dry, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Thank you, Mr. Harding. Let me first clarify. This is not a business. I'm not selling anything. It's a personal space, a place to sit, chat, and enjoy a beverage. It's really no different from having a porch swing and offering your neighbor a lemonade. I've adhered to all the regulations you've put forth in your new rules. Neutral colors, limited decor, minimal lighting, noise kept in check. The only difference is what I call it, a pub. But that's just a name. I'd argue it's fostering more community spirit than anything else on our street." Murmurs of agreement rustled through the audience. Joe Harding stiffened. "The concern is that calling it a pub might encourage social gatherings that disturb neighbors. We've had at least one anonymous complaint about late-night chatter." I recognize the tactic. The mention of an anonymous complaint was a classic HOA move. I exhaled quietly, then responded. "I'm sorry to hear someone was disturbed. I tried to be respectful of noise levels. If there's a specific time I need to wrap up conversations, I'm more than willing to comply. But we're talking about a few retirees sipping iced tea before 10. It's hardly boisterous." A woman in the front row, a face I recognized from one of my porch gatherings, spoke up. "I live just 2 doors down. I've never heard a peep. It's quieter than my grandkids, that's for sure." Another neighbor added, "I think it's a lovely idea. My husband and I have gotten to know folks on the street in a way we never did before." Harriet raised her hand. Maybe it's time the HOA consider how to encourage more community interaction, not less. We're not talking about neon signs and jukeboxes blaring until 2 a.m. We're talking about a well-maintained porch that brightens the block. Joe Harding's expression soured as a chorus of agreement spread throughout the small crowd. He tapped his pen against the table, trying to regain control. We have a responsibility to maintain the aesthetic standards of our neighborhood. While I appreciate everyone's input, the board must decide if the concept of a porch pub undermines our vision. With that, the board conferred in hushed tones, occasionally casting furtive glances toward me and the neighbors. I suspect they were torn between upholding their rulebook and not wanting a revolt from half the people in the room. After a few minutes, Joe Harding cleared his throat again, addressing the group. The board agrees to allow Mr. West's porch setup to remain as is, provided there are no formal complaints regarding noise or inappropriate gatherings in the future. However, we will be adding a clause to our guidelines clarifying the permitted uses of front porches to ensure they remain consistent with community standards. Relief washed over me, though it was tinged with a bit of annoyance at the new clause. Still, it seemed like a victory. The board was essentially forced to acknowledge that I hadn't done anything explicitly against the rules and that the neighbors clearly enjoyed it. We walked out of that meeting with smiles on our faces, except Joe Harding, who looked vaguely like he just swallowed a lemon whole. Back at my house, the group of us decided to have a little celebration on the porch. We turned on the soft string lights, poured some iced tea, and for those who wanted something stronger, a discreet shot of whiskey from my private stock. As we toasted each other under the gentle glow, I couldn't help but feel triumphant. We weren't just celebrating a porch pub. We were celebrating the idea that a neighborhood isn't meant to be a series of closed-off boxes. It's meant to be a living, breathing community. In the weeks and months that followed, I continued to hold small gatherings. There was a definite ripple effect. More neighbors began sprucing up their porches, sometimes hosting small coffee meetups or potluck dinners. The term community building got tossed around, sometimes ironically, but there was truth to it. Even Joe Harding softened over time. He'd occasionally pass by, and once or twice he even paused for a chat, though he never took me up on my offer to sit and share a drink. I suspected that deep down he might have admired the friendly atmosphere, but simply couldn't admit it without seeming inconsistent. Harriet made a point of telling me one evening, as she sipped her iced tea under the porch lights, "You know, Martin, this little pub of yours did more than just push back against HOA rules. It gave the neighbors something we all needed, connection." I smiled at that, gazing at the sign above the barrel and remembering how it all started with one irritating letter demanding I remove my cherished porch items. Life is funny that way. Sometimes something meant to restrict you ends up granting you new freedom. My personal porch pub had become an emblem of defiance, yes, but also of togetherness. And so Martin's Porch Pub carried on, a cozy nook in a cookie-cutter suburb, where folks of all stripes could gather, share a story, and maybe, just maybe, remember that life is better when we savor it together. Sure, the HOA might enact 100 more guidelines, but as I learned, creativity and community spirit can't be banished by an official letter. And that, I think, is the real secret to turning an obstacle into an opportunity, holding on to the spark that makes life worth living, and then sharing it with everyone around you. If you love this story of creativity and community, you won't want to miss our next tale of unexpected rebellion and heartwarming connections. Click here to watch it now, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to keep exploring these amazing stories. See you there.